not a pretension. I'm actually having a terrible throat problem, so I'm apologizing in advance for that. This book, Mary, was written by the wonderful author and my friend Janis Cooke Newman. It is a novel of Mary Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, like you have never seen her before. I encourage you all to read it. It is a wonderful examination of her life as well as womanhood in the 19th century, in the era that she lived. Just to give you a little bit of a setup, the novel takes the form of a diary or a memoir that Mary herself has written as she is confined in a lunatic asylum, which in fact she was for the latter part of her life. She was released some years before her death, but she spent a good amount of time there. So this is her memory of her life. She was a remarkable woman. Everyone thinks of her as a lunatic, and she did have some emotional problems, certainly. But she was the first woman to be called First Lady. She was a political strategist who helped her husband immensely, especially in the early years when it was not frowned upon. When she was in the public eye, it was a little more difficult for her to be a visible supporter or strategist of her husband. Anyway, I'm going to read a section for you that is about her efforts to alleviate the suffering of some of the soldiers in the hospital that is in Washington City. In other words, there were many, many hospitals, but this particular one is called Mount Pleasant. And again, I apologize if I run out of steam. Like so many soldiers' hospitals that had been hastily built about Washington City, Mount Pleasant was not much more than a cavernous barracks occupied by wounded soldiers and blowflies. When I first began to visit, I brought gifts which had been sent to the president's house, baskets of whiskey and homemade cakes. But after learning that a great many soldiers suffered from scurvy, I always brought oranges, saving them for the victims of the illness, whom I recognized by their gums turned swollen and purple as grapes. One of these was Sergeant Tobias Warren, who was of the same age as my son, Robert, and nearly as handsome, save for the scurvy, which had turned his gums to bleed over his teeth, dyeing them pink. Sergeant Warren had been wounded in the hand. A bullet had passed through the center of his palm, severing the nerves so that his fingers curled in upon themselves like a flower made of flesh. It was his right hand which was wounded, and on the day that I met him, I saw that he struggled with his left to peel his orange. "Let me do that for you," I offered. I took back the orange and pulled off the skin, placing the sections into his uninjured palm. I don't expect anybody will believe that the First Lady fed me oranges. Sergeant Warren was from Indiana and spoke in a slurred drawl that reminded me of my husband. Nobody except my son, I confided, who does not consider any status I might achieve excuse to neglect my mothering. I brought Sergeant Warren oranges for a week, and at the end of it, he asked if I would help write a letter to his mother. I found paper and ink and sat beside Sergeant Warren's bed as he dictated the letter. The correspondence was nearly 3 pages long. In it, he used the word love 4 times. As summer shifted into autumn, I continued to visit with Sergeant Warren. His scurvy lessened and his gums no longer bled, but I still brought him oranges, still peeled them and placed them in his uninjured hand. Once, before I could drop the sections into his palm, he reached up and wrapped the fingers of that hand around my own, held it long enough to let me know the gesture was done from affection, not to say that he did not want oranges or to relay any practical message. Each time I came, I was surprised to discover that the sergeant was still in his bed, for he appeared to me to be only slightly wounded. "Sergeant Warren is plagued with fevers," muttered Mount Pleasant's chief doctor, a man of near 70 who had retired and now resented the war for taking him out of it. I was sorry to learn that the sergeant was not entirely well, but I was always happy to see him there. At times, I pretended that Sergeant Warren was my son Robert, my eldest son gone to war, now returned, lightly wounded, but altered, made more affectionate toward the living when faced so forcibly with death. If this were Robert, I thought, I would bring him oranges and anything else he desired. I would hold his injured hand and take it to my breast and kiss it. And for once, I would be entirely successful nursing back to health a son who needed it. Upon an afternoon near the close of October, an autumn day of hard brightness, I came to Mount Pleasant and discovered another soldier in Sergeant Warren's bed. At last he is recovered, I told myself, and I went looking for the doctor to learn whether the handsome sergeant had been sent back to the war or home to his mother, as I wished. I found the irritable old gentleman stitching together a rough-edged wound. "Warren?" he asked in response to my question. I pointed to the bed in which Sergeant Warren had passed most of the summer. The doctor squinted through blowflies, then turned back to his stitching. "Dead," he told me. "That cannot be right," I said to him. "Sergeant Warren had a small wound, and it was very nearly healed." The doctor put the end of a new piece of stitching thread in his mouth, wetting it for the needle. "Poisoning of the blood," he muttered. "It happens with some frequency." The stench of gangrene, which the autumn afternoon could not blow away, slid into my nose and throat, filled up my mouth, until I tasted the sweetish scent of the body turning upon itself, poisoning its own blood, blackening its own limbs. This is the smell of death, I thought, and it will find Robert upon a battlefield or in the hospital like this one, full of blowflies. It will seek from here, and it will find Taddy too, feeding upon his fevers and turning his blood against him. Then it will come seeking my husband, lodging itself in his wasted frame, which has no strength to fight it. It will come, this stench which carries death, to everyone I love, the way it has already come to Willie and to Eddie. For I am cursed in a way which draws it to those who mean the most to me. My oranges fell to the floor, rolling beneath the soldiers' cots, and I turned and ran between the long row of beds, hurrying past the men who had already paid the hospital's tax of an arm or a leg, and those who still hoped not to. I needed to stand in the wind and let it blow the sting of death from my clothes so I would not carry it home. I rushed from the building. I ran to the first carriage I saw and threw myself into it. "Drive," I cried to the man seated upon the bench. "Where?" he asked me. "Any place that is not here. Take me out of this quarter," I called up. I need a destination. I thought for only a moment. "Pennsylvania Avenue," I told him. After Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania Avenue's brilliant shops glowed with life. The windows showed silks instead of wrapping bandages, boots which were only sold in pairs, gloves fashioned for unfurled fingers. "Let me down here," I said to the driver, for I needed to walk in this air which was sweetened only by the scent of perfume and new leather. The pavement of Pennsylvania Avenue felt safe and solid beneath my feet. I walked until I had ceased to smell death, then slowed and gazed into windows filled with objects which were new and unbroken. In one, a silver tea service sat shining upon a velvet-covered pedestal. The service was so bright with reflected light from the store's gas lamps, it seemed that it generated the radiance upon its own. "I must see that service close," I told the desk clerk inside. "It is made of a high grade of silver," he said, placing the shining pieces before me. "Very lasting." I removed my gloves and ran my hands along the smooth, undamaged surfaces. All was unmarked, untainted, and if any of it should blacken, I could polish it back to brightness. "Have this sent to the President's house," I said to the clerk, although I already owned a tea service and had no need of another. When the service arrived, I had the boxes brought to my room, where I sat upon the bed and unpacked every piece of it. I held the sugar bowl and the creamer in my hands, and their gleaming weight seemed a promise that the infection which sickened limbs would not find Robert, that whatever it was which poisoned blood would keep from Taddy. The serving pot offered me assurance that my husband would survive the burdens of his office, that the war would not eat out his life. I kept the silver service in my closet, where I might look upon it whenever I felt the need of its unmarred durability. 2 days later, when Robert wrote again, begging to go back to war, and a hint of the gangrene filled my nose and mouth, I returned to the shop and purchased a set of silver plates to keep it company.
From Peter Orner's new novel, Love and Shame and Love. And I was thinking about what to say when I was introducing Peter Orner, and you could read this back of the book, and you could say that he's been awarded 2 Pushcart Prizes and a Guggenheim Fellowship, and he's taught at the University of Montana and the Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa. You could say that he's a professor at San Francisco State. I think there's a bunch of other awards and fellowships that just kind of slipped out of that bio because, they were sort of just pushed down as Guggenheims and Iowa came along. But I think that what I really want to say about this is, this book just really knocked my socks off. It's such a funny and heartbreaking and touching and stylistically and structurally experimental book. It made me rethink everything I've written in the past and everything I will write in the future. It made me rethink, what a chapter is and what a sentence is. And I'm not just saying that. It really did make me rethink what a chapter is and what a sentence is. And so when I chose what to read, I chose sections that would sort of illustrate the stylistic and structural experimentation that is going on here, and also a lot of the sort of emotional heft. Now I've lost my bookmark, which tells me which pages to read, but I think I can remember. All right. This section's called The Lake, and I'm not going to introduce anything because there's so many names that I don't want to get too complicated. But there's Alexander, who's Popper, and then there's Philip, who I believe is his dad, and then there's Seymour, who's his dad, and that's all I'm going to tell you. This is called The Lake. His father taught him to swim by tossing him off the fishing pier at Cary Avenue Beach. Cold drizzle. Sink or swim, kid. Popper was 4. Lake Michigan in his mouth, his ears up to his nose. The lake calm that day, and rain was falling slowly. So calm, he could concentrate completely on the cold. It was like being dropped into an icy bowl of cloudy soup, and it felt oddly right. The rush, the flailing around for breath itself. And his father on the pier shouting, "Pull, Alexander, pull the water." Fingers together, thumbs locked, and now pull. Lake Michigan is 307 miles long, 118 miles at its widest, a total area of 22,300 square miles. What's so great about the lake, Philip would say, and Leo and Popper would shout, "No salt." Ever since Popper had imagined God with a huge salt shaker, his grandfather Seymour's, the one in the shape of Uncle Sam, so enormous God needs to hold it with both hands as he scatters salt and ruins the world's oceans. Yet God left the Great Lakes pure because we in the Midwest are made of superior moral timber. The lake is always east. East is always the lake, and so is Jerusalem. At 10, he will swim to the sandbar off Cary Avenue Beach and stand on top of blue itself, his blue, Lake Michigan. 6th largest lake in the world, and young, very young. At 10,000 years, in geological terms, Lake Michigan is a punk. But that first time, bobbing upward, the sky upside down, his father vanished. Popper wasn't thinking about salt or size or even of water. Though water was there, was all there was and ever would be. Water in his own skin, the uproar in his ears, and the way the cold made him nothing. This section is called the East Window. Or the grandfather clock downstairs, how Philip would never forget to wind it. He'd pull the chains and set the hands with his finger, and it would start again. The relentlessness of that talking, no ticking, only talking. And for years it lulled him until, at no time he could pinpoint, it stopped being a comfort. This is all he knows, that one night it soothed him, and the next night, and forever after, it didn't. His room, with the built-in white cabinets and the blue horseshoe wallpaper. Popper would lie there and listen to that talking all night long, trying to hold the moment of the silent pause between beats. Now he's certain he never slept an inch in all those years in that house, although of course he must have. He must have. It stands to reason. In order to wake up, you have to sleep. But he doesn't ever remember opening his eyes in that room, because they were always already open, staring out at the dark east window, waiting for the first light to come slantwise out from behind the lake. This next section is called Hollis Osgood. Miriam and Philip hired a houseman. Everyone else in Highland Park seemed to have a maid. Only the Poppers had a man. He put up the storm windows. He ran errands in Miriam's VW Bug. Hollis babysat. He cooked. He slept in a small room in the basement from Tuesday to Friday. Mondays and weekends, the Poppers were on their own. At cocktail parties, Hollis would wear a light blue shirt with ruffles and a black bow tie, and serve drinks with jokes and a plum that always left the guests shrilling. We simply loved Hollis. Where on earth did you find him? A huge man. Nights he'd fall asleep in his basement chair by the ping pong table, reading by the white light of the television. He liked his novels thick and endless, Shogun and Clan of the Cave Bear, The Thornbirds. Popper would crawl over the mountain of him and sneak the clicker, one of those prehistoric ones that sounded like a staple gun, out of his hand and lie on the carpet beside his chair and change the channels until the racket would wake Hollis up and he'd say, "Rhodey, turn it back to Johnny Carson before I count to 1.5. He smoked mentholated cools. He said that he had a daughter who lived in Cleveland, but the way he said the word, separating it out, Cleveland, it sounded to Popper as if he meant to say she was dead, or so far away from him that she might as well be. A Korean war vet. Korean emergency, Hollis called it. Precisely whose emergency, I'm still trying to decipher. He lost 2 fingers during the Battle of Chosin. One was shot off, he said. The other froze off. Xander, which do you think I'd rather go through again? Shot off. You already told me. When he gripped Popper's neck, there was always something missing. There was strength, yes, he was strong, but there was also emptiness, and not only because of his missing fingers. His stomach, solid as a refrigerator. Popper would make running starts from the back door, sprint into him, and bounce off. Hollis would shout, "Do it again and I'll call my lawyer on you." Philip was his lawyer. Philip was everyone's lawyer. Hollis Osgood was born in Alabama. After Korea, he moved to Chicago to look for work. Miriam found him in the Sun-Times classifieds. You were born into a family. You got found in the classifieds. You were born into a family. You got found in the classifieds. Philip stands in the kitchen, squeaky galoshes. Hollis, do you think this floor is mopped? Do I have to do these things myself? Do I have to come home from an endless day and mop this myself? In memory, Hollis is always taller than he actually was. He wasn't more than 5'7", about the same height as Philip. His stomach made him bigger. His stomach made him not only bigger, but also more substantial, more rooted to the floor. He remembers being worried for his father. Couldn't Hollis at any time have decided to knock his lawyer down with one lazy swing of his hand? Now I'm going to read one last section that I hope kind of ties all these things together. It's called The Hunters. There are Jewish hunters in northern Illinois, and the birds come out and party. Even Hollis, with his experience in the Korean emergency, wasn't a very good shot. They'd wear big yellow safety goggles and fondle their guns and trudge the frozen November fields. Philip had given the boys a choice. Spend Sunday at Sunday school at their Reform Temple, Lakeside Synagogue, learning Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic, and Cherokee, and periodically even Jewish precepts, or head up to the North Country to become a man. The four of them, a platoon of meandering unkillers, marching, silently marching. The land never rose in their eyes, but to call the prairie flat isn't to know it with your feet. To your feet, the November fields are fathomless. The more you walk, the more you never get anywhere. Above the great Maine sky. Hopper liked to put his fingers in the little bullet holders of his hunting coat and walk with his eyes closed. But those hunting fields were so stocked with game that even hunting with the Lhasa Apso, they couldn't avoid some action. Sir Edmund, in spite of his pampered backyard life, turned out to be pretty good at flushing birds. Even one of the old regulars at the hunt club, a one-eyed man named Kai, said of Sir Edmund, "Now that little hound has talent." Pheasants aren't very hard to shoot. First there's that hysterical nuthouse cackling, and then the running start, followed by a slow rise, like a fat, wide-bodied plane taking off. Occasionally, with their volley of shots, someone would hit a bird. Sir Edmund would retrieve the body. It was Popper's job to ferry the deceased, and he liked that part. He was a backward kangaroo, the pheasant against his back, warm, bleeding, heavy with the putty-like inertness of the newly murdered. Every third field or so, there was a rack and a row of nails. Birds would be hanging there like spent rags, their eyes as if pried open. Later, a man would come in a pickup truck and throw the birds into the bed of the truck and drive them to the lodge, where they'd be made into pheasant burgers, pheasant stew, pheasant casserole, and frozen pheasant to go. So he would have to give up his bleeding child and squeeze another little neck between the nails. And Philip would say, with near reverence, "These birds were raised to be killed, so we're only doing our part, playing our role in nature's great cycle of life and death and food on the table. Besides, if we don't shoot them, the next barbarian will. And then what? Isn't that right, Hollis?"
That was beautiful, Michael. Thank you very much. We just met tonight, and it's so interesting and different to hear what you tried to write. Somebody reading it so beautifully. It's really moving. It's also really nice to pick up a book and just sink into it, into a world that you know nothing about, a world you're not prepared for. So much of what I tend to read, unfortunately, I sort of know what to expect. I know from the first page or so what kind of world I'm entering. In this book, in Michael David Lukas's book, The Oracle of Istanbul, I just sunk into it, and it was such a wonderful thing, and I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for the wonderful energy and terrific invention of this book that took me to Istanbul in 1877 in the waning days of the Ottoman Empire. Among other things, many, many other things, this book is about how one extraordinary girl can change the course of history. And her name is Eleonora. I'll say a little bit about Michael before I start. Michael's the author of The Oracle of Istanbul, which came out last year. He's been a Fulbright Scholar in Turkey, a night shift proofreader in Tel Aviv, and a waiter at the Bread Loaves Writers Conference in Vermont. Which is quite prestigious. It is. It's the best to be a waiter. A graduate of Brown University, his writings appeared in Virginia Quarterly Review, Slate, National Geographic, and many other places. And Michael lives in Oakland, nearby. And I also want to thank Peg for putting on this wonderful reading series. I think it's become one of the great events in the Bay Area. And I'm very happy to be back. Chapter 1. Eleanor Cohen came into this world on a Thursday, late in the summer of 1877. Those who rose early that morning would recall noticing a flock of purple and white hoopoes circling above the harbor, looping and darting about as if in attempt to mend a tear in the firmament. Whether or not they were successful, the birds eventually slowed their swoop and settled in around the city on the steps of the courthouse, the red-tiled roof of the Constanza Hotel, and the bell tower atop St. Basil's Academy. They roosted in the lantern room of the lighthouse, the octagonal stone minaret of the mosque, and the forward deck of a steamer coughing puffs of smoke into an otherwise clear horizon. Hoopoes coated the town like frosting, piped in along the rain gutters of the governor's mansion, and slathered on the gilt dome of the Orthodox Church. In the trees around Jacob and Leah Cohn's house, the flock seemed especially excited, chattering, flapping their wings, and hopping from branch to branch like a crowd of peasants lining the streets of the capital for an imperial parade. The hoopoes would probably have been regarded as an auspicious sign were it not for the unfortunate events that coincided with Eleanor's birth. Early that morning, the 3rd Division of Tsar Alexander II's Royal Cavalry rode in from the north and assembled on a hilltop overlooking the town square. 612 men, 537 horses, 3 cannons, 24 dull gray canvas tents, a field kitchen, and the yellow and black striped standard of the Tsar. They'd been riding for the better of a fortnight with reduced rations and little rest. And all that morning, and late into the afternoon, the men of the 3rd Division rode rampant through the streets of Constanza, breaking shop windows, terrorizing stray dogs, and pulling down whatever statues they could find. They torched the governor's mansion. They ransacked the courthouse and shattered the stained glass above the entrance to St. Basil's Academy. The goldsmiths was guttered, the cobblers picked clean, and the dry goods store strewn with broken eggs and tea. They shattered the front window of Jacob Cohn's carpet shop and punched holes in the walls with their bayonets. And yet, she's born. And I'm going to move forward into chapter 3. In spite of Aunt Alexandra's repeated efforts to shoot him away, the hoopoes that had attended Eleanor's birth settled permanently in a fig tree outside the Cohn's house, as a result of which the front walk was perpetually splattered with a slick coat of green and white bird droppings. It was not clear at first why the flock was so intent on inhabiting this particular tree, why they would tolerate broom and bleach and boiling water when there were any number of more hospitable roofs nearby. With time, however, it became apparent that their attraction was connected in some way to Eleonora. It was almost as if they regarded her as part of their flock, the queen without which their lives had no purpose. They slept when she slept, stood guard while she bathed, and when she left the house, a small contingency broke off to follow along overhead. They were strange birds, in both appearance and behavior, but eventually Eleanor's flock became a part of daily life, a familiar fixture atop East Hill. and the townspeople paid them no more attention than they did the pigeons lined up along the gutters of the Constanta Hotel. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm moving around a little bit, but I want to go into Eleanor's first memory here. Eleanor's first memory was of an incident that took place just after her 4th birthday. It was on the halcyon blue afternoon in early fall that she first realized the power of her concentration. Barefoot and dressed in a simple red cotton smock, Eleanor sat cross-legged under the tomato vines, digging a hole in the wet, clumpy earth with her fingers. There was a warm breeze blowing up the hill. The hoopos were chattering among themselves, and from the back steps one could see all the way to Navodari. She had just scooped up a shiny gray pill bug and was watching it unfurl itself in her palm when she heard a rustling at the edge of the garden. It was a deer, tentatively poking his head out from the forest, and she watched it take a step forward into the onion patch, then a half step back. To see a deer in the garden was not unusual, but there was something about this particular young buck that caught her attention. After observing the animal through the tomato vines for a few moments, Eleonora decided to investigate. Brushing the pill bug back into its hole, Eleonora stood and crossed the garden. The deer did not move, though it seemed anxious being in such close proximity to a human. Standing at the edge of the onion patch, less than an arm's length away from it, she could feel its warm, sour breath on her forehead. She looked up into the polished granite of its eyes and brought her hand slowly to rest at the base of its neck. Still, it did not move. Beyond the quivering of its nostrils and the soft rise of her own breath, both stood completely still. Then, in one motion, the buck stepped back and lowered its antlers, lifting its left leg like a soldier presenting its weapon for inspection. Eleanor immediately saw the cause of the animal's distress, and she knew what she would need to do. Just above the hoof lay a barb, a twisted piece of metal buried deep in the flesh. It looked as if it had snapped off of a fence and perhaps some hunting implement. Brushing a strand of hair out of her eyes, Eleanor took the injured limb in her hand and inspected the wound. The veins around it were pulsing frantically, and a white froth bubbled up against the metal. The deer's leg hair bristled as she brought her free hand towards it. She blinked, and with one swift tug, removed the barb. Watching the deer bound off through the forest, Eleanor quivered at the thought of what she had just done. The hoopos above her broke into a chorus of throaty chirps, and the very crunch of the underbrush sounded like a subtle applause. Her ovation, however, was not long to last. A moment later, she was caught up by her armpits and carried to the bathroom. "You must never," Aunt Alexandra said, pulling her frock up from her head, "ever do that again. If this gets out..." She stood, hunched over herself, shivering in the middle of the bathroom while Alexandra prepared a washcloth. Eleonora had never seen her aunt like this. She seemed shaken, scared almost. "What do you mean, Alexandra? What did I do?" In lieu of a reply, Alexandra began scrubbing vigorously with a soapy washcloth. First the arms, then the hands, especially between the fingers. "Please," Eleanor whined, "tell me what I did wrong. I can't be better if I don't know what I did." Alexandra stopped scrubbing. "It's not normal to cavort with animals. We have enough troubles as it is being Jews and your father constantly shipping carpets to Istanbul. The last thing we need to do is attract more attention." "But it was hurt," Eleanor said. "It was a piece of